I'm Sam Roberts of the New York Times, and welcome to the New York Times Close Up. A tumultuous week within the journalistic community as well as the world. First, we'll be joined by Arthur Browne, the last editor-in-chief and publisher of the New York Daily News, before it was taken over by Tronc, a company that just dismissed half the paper's reporters and editors. Later, we'll talk with Times reporter Ashley Southall about the article she and Jan Ransom wrote on the city violating its own ban by isolating inmates younger than 22 and the mayor's subsequent response. My Times colleagues discuss the latest issues of the week on The Backstory, and I'll offer some additional thoughts on Coda. But first, Arthur Browne, who left the paper last January just in time. He's also, of course, the author of One Righteous Man, Samuel Battle, and The Shattering of the Color Line in New York. Arthur, what is Tronc besides an awful name?
Tronc is a media company that owns a chain of newspapers in many cities across the country. It is, the name is a descendant of the Tribune Publishing. It comes out of the remnants of the Tribune Company bankruptcy in Chicago.
Did this have to happen? Tronc bought the news for $1 from Mort Zuckerman. Half the staff is gone. That means something like maybe 40, 50 reporters left. Can they put out a newspaper in New York with a staff that small?
First, did it have to happen? This was clearly a financial decision by Tronc, probably a very short-term financial decision to meet some numbers. In my view, it did not have to happen, and enlightened management would have instead invested in the ways that might be able to make money at the Daily News. It would have taken some time, maybe you're talking 6 months, 9 months, but wiser strategic choices may have saved a lot at the Daily News. Instead, they've chosen to try to cut their way to success, to profitability, which in my view is an absolute impossibility. Now, as for what you can do, what the Daily News can do now, it is a shriveled enterprise journalistically. It will be able to do some things. It will not be able to cover New York with the thoroughness and the verve that the Daily News always brought to its coverage.
We saw a lot of letters, including letters in the news. The news had our backs. It was the real eyes and ears of the city. No way New York's hometown paper could do the adequate journalistic job with a skeleton crew. I happen to have at home a copy of the news from June. There were 31 articles before the editorial pages. Now there are only 18. What do they do? I mean, how can you put out a paper like that? And is anyone going to bother reading it anymore?
It's the Daily News has some very loyal readers. And I believe that this betrays them, that this tells them that Tronc does not care about them, is not particularly interested in connecting with them in the way that the Daily News always tried to connect with their readers. So they will find a very reduced diet of stories, information, whatever there was in the Daily News, it will be shrunken for them. It's a signal that Tronc it needs to meet some financial imperatives and is willing to sacrifice print in the hope that it can survive digitally, and that's based on what they've done, that I believe is a slim hope.
And Arthur, as we've discussed before, digitally, a lot of that readership digitally, assuming it makes money at all, that readership is largely out of town, not New York.
That's correct. Much of the digital audience is national. Now, it does not have to be that way, I believe. Or in the alternative, I believe that you can create a local Daily News product that would appeal to far more people outside New York than the local coverage now does. And that's the challenge for whoever is the editor of that paper. Now, I do not envy Mr. York, who's taken over, because one, he doesn't really know New York. Two, the Tronc name, I believe, is radioactive in terms of hiring journalists.
Who would go work there at this
Well,
point?
that's the question, right? You know, you would have to show some real forward motion, some real plan for better journalism at the Daily News in order to attract people to come to work there. That's a major hurdle that this enterprise is going to have to face.
We hear a lot of lamentations, as we did when New York Newsday folded. Now we hear, you know, where's the news going? We were so loyal. On the other hand, when you and I were working at the Daily News, at one point the circulation was 2 million a day. Now it's down to something like 200,000. So where did all those loyal readers go? Isn't that part of the problem too?
That is part of the problem. New York is a changing city, and the readership that was so loyal to the Daily News it began to decrease over time. And I believe that immigration had an important role to play in the fate of the Daily News, where immigration once built it, a solid immigration of Irish, Italian, German, big blocks of immigrants that you could appeal to. This immigration is very diffuse, and I'm not sure that any of the mainstream media has captured the immigrant reader in the way that papers used to. That's one force. More recently, the switch of readership habits from paper to tablets, phones, all the digital streams of communication, and a much more diffuse stream of communications and information. And the Daily News did not keep up with that, like other mainstream or so-called legacy newspapers. Did not get ahead of the wave. And now the wave is crashing right over it.
I think we can all agree that there has been a decline in local news coverage in the city, probably in many cities around the country, as we compete for readers globally, and it becomes less important from a business standpoint, at least, to cover local news. Where does that leave readers? Where does it leave the question of civic engagement in New York City?
I think it's very detrimental to civic engagement. I think it's very detrimental to the cause of holding government accountable. There are going to be smaller, I believe, digital news organizations that attempt to cover the city, and collectively they may be able to have some mass in doing it, but I don't see an individual force in local journalism that would be able to have the breadth to deal with the politics, the government, the crime, the criminal justice, housing, all the issues that an important media organization should tackle.
When you look back at some of the things you did, the Bushwick series, other things like that, the news, especially the news, although certainly the Times on occasion, had real impact. It was able to move City Hall. It was able to move Albany through editorials, through series. Is that going to happen anymore?
I think that it has greatly diminished. I believe that the power of the Daily News has greatly diminished. And this, I believe, is a severe blow to its standing in the power ecosystem of New York. And that is a bad thing for the public, because it stood for something. It was not self-interested in any way. It always attempted to be on the side of the readers when facing the power. And when its vitality is sapped, I believe that the public will suffer.
Is there any model that can replace it? A nonprofit model, a philanthropic model, a subscription model? Is there anything else that can take its place?
I like to think that could happen. I like to think,
in fact, we are seeing in New Jersey a government subsidy model.
Right, which I would not advocate for. But I'd like to think that in New York City, I like the phrase that there's enough money in search of meaning in New York City that you could be able to assemble the funding necessary to support a nonprofit news organization that would supply content to any outlet in New York City that wanted to share in that content. I think that could happen, and I'd like to see it happen because I think it's very important.
The new editor of the paper has said to staffers, give me 30 days. Let me demonstrate that I can take this publication in the right direction. Is there really anything that he or anyone can do in 30 days to demonstrate that he can save the Daily News and make it a paper that's worthwhile reading?
You would have to be Superman in the lobby of the old Daily News building to accomplish that in 30 days.
Thank you for joining us with that hopeful report. Arthur Browne, the last editor-in-chief and publisher of the New York Daily News before it was sold to Tronc. Good luck in your latest venture. Coming up next, my Times colleague, Ashley Southall. Welcome back. Joining me now, my Times colleague, Ashley Southall, with Jan Ransom. She wrote about young inmates being transferred upstate to jails where they were placed in isolation, a violation of the city's own rules. Mayor de Blasio then defended the practice. He said occasionally sending inmates upstate who pose a security or safety risk seemed to be okay. Now, Ashley, first of all, why are they segregated at all, and why does it make sense to send them upstate?
The city tells us that these inmates are segregated and sent upstate or to other jails such as Nassau, Rockland, because there's a threat to their safety, or they are a threat to the safety of other inmates and guards at the jail. So these are inmates who may have been involved in assaults on guards, and not just, a slap or a scratch, but more like an officer's spine was fractured or nose broken.
So what does it say about the system that we can't protect them in our system, or the guards can't protect themselves?
I think that's a question for City Hall. We have one of the largest correctional systems in the country, and here in New York City, we have 8 operational jails on Rikers Island. We have detention centers in the boroughs, and over 10,000 guards. So the idea that the city can't handle these young inmates who they say are responsible for this serious violence is a major question for everybody. Why not?
And what's the downside to either to the system or to the individuals of sending them out of town and then putting them in solitary?
Well, when these inmates are sent out of town 2.5, 3 hours away to Albany, they are out of sight of the city. So even though they're in the city's custody, the city can't see what goes on to them. They only know what Albany tells them or what Rockland tells them, and they don't. All these other jurisdictions don't have the same rules as New York City. New York City has banned solitary confinement for people who are 21 and younger. In the rest of the state, that's still pretty legal. There are no limits to how long they can stay. In New York City, we have rules that were designed based with the science in mind that solitary, especially being in there long term, has deleterious effects. It can lead to depression, anxiety, suicidal thoughts.
And we've seen that happen before, in fact.
Yes.
Now, the mayor scored some progressive points by instituting this policy in the first place. How come he now seems to be defending it?
The mayor still thinks that the policy, that he seems to think that because it's only, 10 or 15 young people that they're sending every year, that it's not a big deal, and that it's just something that they do in extreme circumstances, and he seems to think that their oversight of it is enough. But clearly that's not the case from what we've found and what we've heard from lawyers. And so these inmates and some of their lawyers are going to be challenging these transfers in the courts.
What was it like reporting this story with Jan? Were the inmates cooperative? Were their lawyers cooperative? And was the correctional system, which is usually pretty uncooperative, helpful at all?
Sure. This is a rare issue that unites both advocates for inmates and the correction officers union. So they were very helpful when you're talking about, most of these inmates rely on public defenders. They are poor, they're normally African American or Latino, so they rely on public defenders who also have practices that challenge systemic policies, and this is emerging as one of them. So the way that we learned about these transfers and that the city was increasingly using them was through defense lawyers. And they were afraid of putting their clients in more danger. They alleged beatings in Albany by the guards as retaliation for the assaults that occurred on Rikers. So they were afraid, but at the same time they knew that regardless of whether they spoke out, they were still going to be where they are.
Aren't the jails in the city at least under capacity? Isn't there room for putting these people in a secure facility somewhere in New York City?
Well, that's what we seem to think. I mean, the New York City jails, the ones that are operational, can hold more than 11,000 people. And the average daily population at Rikers, you have people cycling in and out, but you also have people who are there for several months, years at a time, awaiting trial. There are about 9,000 or so people there. So the city, they've created units in lieu of solitary for young people. They use them, but it's not clear why they don't have a space for these especially problematic people.
And what do they say when you ask them?
They told us it wasn't a story. And so that was a red flag for us. But, they say, we can't prevent what happens to them, but we are taking steps to promote safety. And this is all about safety for our inmates and our guards. And to the extent that they are unsafe, they claim not to know, but this is an issue that the lawyers have raised and that the inmates have raised. So I think we'll see some changes coming.
And I'm sure we'll see some more stories on it. Ashley Southall of the New York Times, thanks for joining us. And the backstory is next. Welcome back. What kind of week has it been? One of bobbing and weaving by the president, the death of a Staten Island fixture, Guy Molinari, and a tabloid shrunk to mini iPad size. Joining me to discuss these stories and more, my Times colleagues, contributing writer Eleanor Randolph and City Hall Bureau reporter William Newman. Willie, the mayor said this week that he is not a micromanager, that he really doesn't know much of what's going on in detail about city government. A, is that true? And B, is that a good thing?
It's true and it's not true at the same time. It was sort of an extraordinary admission that he made in a submission in a court case about the affordable housing lottery. And he, in order to avoid being deposed in the court case, he made a big show of talking in writing about how little he actually knows about the doings of his own government. In fact, he's a guy who's he's both extremely engaged and not engaged.
We know he doesn't know that much about lead paint in the housing authority.
For instance, he rarely meets with his commissioners. He meets a lot with his political team and somewhat with his deputy mayors. But he is a micromanager in that he gets very involved in lots of decisions and also stops a lot of decisions from being made because his commissioners will send decisions to City Hall, then will sit there for months and months and months because while he and his team sort of mull over the possible consequences of
that sounds like micromanaging to me.
It is.
So is he not being forthcoming, as we like to say?
It reminds me of in baseball when the teams are in arbitration with their good players and they go into these meetings and they talk about how terrible the players are so they don't have to pay them that much money. It's a gambit to avoid being deposed, but hopefully he will be deposed and then have to answer frankly and openly about how he does manage government.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, the way a mayor manages this huge government and this, 8.5 million people is really, it's really crucial. And clearly this man does not delegate enough. And, all the sort of management people you talk to say what you do is you hire the best people you can find and you delegate to those people and you let them bounce up when they feel they need to. But most of the time you trust them to do the job. We don't see that with this mayor. And as a result, there are a number of cases, and Willie just mentioned it, that when just no is their favorite answer to things. And you know, where do we go as a city if every time it bounces up to the mayor's office, they're saying, well, I don't know, you know, this might be a political problem for us.
There's a tremendous amount of frustration among the people who work with him about actually
hear
getting
that all
things
the time.
done.
But how well or not well is the government actually run? This is a test after a number of years of Republican mayors, obviously, where a progressive is running the government. The economy is reasonably good, and it's kind of a test of whether a progressive or a liberal can administer the government. Is he succeeding or not?
I think on one level, the government writ large runs itself. I mean, there's this big bureaucratic apparatus. The garbage gets picked up, et cetera.
But we used to complain about some other liberal mayors that the garbage wasn't getting picked up. And
it was a long time ago. And also,
if the garbage didn't get picked up, you could hear it.
So doesn't he deserve some credit for that or not?
You know, I think that the great trick of Bloomberg was that Bloomberg was an okay manager who convinced everybody that he was a brilliant manager. and we saw that he wasn't, as in the City Times scandal and lots of other things. De Blasio came in with everybody doubting his managerial chops, and the city has run. He has the great fortune of having record tax revenues in the booming economy, and so he hasn't really had to swim upstream at all. And so there haven't been, well, there actually have been huge management blunders. Look at the lead paint scandal at NYCHA, for instance. Clearly that was a management issue. Look at the Rivington House scandal, where a nursing home, or rather a facility on the Lower East Side, through a series of bureaucratic blunders, ends up in the hands of these developers, and nobody was paying attention.
Eleanor, you're writing a book about Mayor Bloomberg. Is that a fair comparison, would you say?
Well, I would say that one of the ways you can tell about a great mayor or a great manager is how he or she does when there's an emergency. And I don't think that de Blasio has really had an emergency. He hadn't had a Hurricane Sandy. He hasn't seen the way you have to sort of unify this whole city to get things done. He hadn't faced that really, and I hope he won't. I hope he won't have to. I would argue that the way that Bloomberg had his flaws, of course, but he set up the budget and made things a lot easier for de Blasio when he came in. Even the 911 issue, which was really controversial and sort of made enemies among firefighters and police, it's now kind of working, you know. And so he was not afraid to sort of butt his head up against all the forces of the city, which I think this guy is.
It's a little early for the mayor to think about getting out of town, but he is setting up a political action committee for possible future office. And we are talking about him trying to position himself while there are people on the left who may be sort of outflanking him. So where does he go from here?
Well, he was actually asked that today because he's just announcing that he's setting up this fairness PAC. And the idea of that, he says, is, at least in the short term, oriented towards the 2018 midterm elections. And he wants to raise money so that he can give it away to other candidates, thereby make friends, and according to him, influence the outcome of the midterm elections, both with the New York State Senate and nationally. And it also allows him and his wife to travel and campaign on behalf of other candidates, if I suppose they think that's effective. But in the future, it does give him a platform. I mean, first, he's always wanted to raise his national profile. And this is another attempt to do that, and his influence. And he's also actually traveled a lot this year already. He's done several trips, recently to Texas and Mexico. So he says he doesn't want to run in 2020. He doesn't intend to, but we'll see.
We'll see. Thanks to Eleanor Randolph, William Newman for joining me, and I'll have some additional thoughts on Coda. Arching over the limestone frieze of office workers, laborers, artisans, and tycoons on the old Daily News building in Midtown is an allusion to a quotation by Lincoln. God must have loved the common man, Lincoln said. He made so many of them. Apparently not enough. At least not enough to sustain the Daily News, which once boasted the largest circulation of any American newspaper. When I joined the News in 1968, it was selling 2 million copies a day. Today, it's lucky to sell 200,000. Sure, the digital edition has many more readers, but most of them are out-of-towners, lured by celebrity news. I confess to nostalgia for newspapers, the roar of the presses, the smell of the ink, but when the Daily News cut its staff in half this week, there was more at stake than sentimentality. The further decline in local news coverage is a loss for democracy. It means one less watchdog over City Hall and Albany to keep officials accountable. Inevitably, that will lead to even less civic engagement by New Yorkers whose apprehensions and aspirations mirror those of the common people whom the Daily News appealed to when it was founded nearly a century ago. Its mission was encapsulated by Finley Peter Dunn's Mr. Dooley. The newspaper does everything for us, comforts the afflicted, and afflicts the comfortable. Soon after the 1977 blackout, the Daily News adopted the Casuso family in Brooklyn as the embodiment of survival in a dying neighborhood. To some white working-class readers, the decline was synonymous with Bushwick's changing racial complexion. But the periodic articles on the Casusos and their neighbors gave voice to people of divergent racial and ethnic backgrounds who shared common challenges and dreams. Those articles achieved something concrete, too. The News sponsored a mayoral debate under a stuffed bobcat in the Casuso's cramped living room, and the victorious candidate, Ed Koch, eventually delivered on his promises for housing and other services. That helped keep the community from dying after all. Today, it's very much alive. Bushwick's revival and the faith it demonstrated is what has kept Kathy Casuso there to this day. Everything had burned down all around us, she told me not long ago. Our house probably would have been next. Nobody knew where to turn. I never remember high-ranking officials coming until the News twisted their arms. The News made a great change in our life and in the lives of everyone in the area. For the New York Times and CUNY TV, I'm Sam Roberts.